My book is called Purple Threads, and it's set in the 1960s and 70s in Australia when I was a child, and it's a memoir in a fictionalised form. It's written as a memoir, but it also takes on some fictional devices. And the story is about the women, in Aboriginal women, and it was written as a testimony to strong Aboriginal women that can be greatly underestimated in the official history of Australia. And it's written as a collection of short stories or episodic stories, which if you read one, it can make sense on its own, but if you read the whole lot, you get a greater sense and value of the book and the characters. And the central characters in the book are strong Aboriginal women who were my aunties, and the book explores a lot about the importance of aunties in Aboriginal culture, in contemporary Aboriginal culture, as well as traditional Aboriginal culture. And the book is also a testimony to the way that Aboriginal women kept the history of our people alive in Australia at a time when it was very difficult, at the height of the assimilation policy, and at some very low points in terms of the history of Aboriginal people. It was largely the Aboriginal women through their stories, and that's how I remained and still remain in contact and continuation of my culture, is because of the history of Aboriginal people that I got from the women who raised me. And it is also a very good example of Aboriginal humour, and it's a very good example of the way Aboriginal people had to survive right up until the 60s or 70s, when a referendum took place to give us citizen rights. And it's about, it juxtaposes two worlds. It juxtaposes the outside world, the official world, like through my school and through other institutions, and the way Aboriginal people have to be constrained and be confined by those institutions, and then it demonstrates the home where the women and the children were in private, and there's a whole different side to the women and children that come out in this private world at home, which is a very, very important and very secure one. And through those conversations that happen in the house, the women provide a very, very important critique of Australian history from an Aboriginal perspective. And you'll see interesting juxtapositions about how I'm being taught at school what's Australian history and what it's like to be Aboriginal, and it was nothing like what it was really like. And then what we get at home, which is a different and a more faithful and realistic version of what it means to be Aboriginal now, how Aboriginal people have survived. Because right up until the 60s in Australia, many people were saying most Aboriginal people are dead or have died out, and there's not very many Aboriginal people left. Whereas there's quite, and I know that colonisation took its toll and the population did drop, but there's actually quite a healthy population of us, and there always was in the 50s and 60s. So it provides that really interesting contrast between a group of people, Aboriginal people, who could be potentially marginalised, but they're not victims, they find other avenues of strength and ways to practice and continue culture that is otherwise outlawed, but it's still kept continuing. And in particular, it is a very good example of the way stories are still an important part of Aboriginal culture, and it disputes that notion that Aboriginal people today, like me, have lost our culture, because we haven't. Our culture is really dynamic, and it has evolved, it has changed, but we still use stories and custodians as the primary way of communicating our history. The assimilation policy in Australia took a number of phases, and there was an unofficial assimilation policy happening before there was an official one happening. Essentially what it was about terrible term, but it was about breeding out Aboriginality from people. So it was about putting Aboriginal people on missions and reserves so that they were forced to speak English and lose languages, and although they weren't actually lost, but that was the intention of it. And it also most seriously involved the removal of Aboriginal children from their families, and that was an official government policy that was actually sanctioned, particularly children who may have had mixed parentage, and from the perspective of the government they'd be seen to be a little bit fairer, a little bit white. Many children, and perhaps you may or may not have heard of the stolen generations of Australia. These stolen generations is the most significant, devastating and detrimental part of the assimilation policy, because the missions were also part of it, but at least on missions people tended to be together, whereas the child removal came later, and it was a little bit unevenly introduced across states, but it was roughly happening from the late 1920s through the 1930s, and it didn't actually stop until the 70s. Well, yeah, see, I'm a historian as well as a writer, and I think that it's a very complex issue around missions and reservations, because on the one hand, they were there to Christianise the people, and they had a manager who would be non-Aboriginal, and checks and balances on those people were very laissez-faire. They could be good, they could be very corrupt. But on the other hand, there was a lot of frontier violence, and so if missions hadn't been part of a government policy, you could say that more Aboriginal people would have died. But so you sort of got to weigh up two things though, but then other people say yes, but the missions were a cultural genocide because they were forcing Christianity. They weren't physically killing people, but they were forcing Christianity, they were forcing English, they were forcing other white ways, I suppose, on people. And I think that the idea of missions is complex. But I think as a historian I have to admit that a culture grew out of missions, which is still very strong too. And they didn't succeed in the end in what they were meant to be doing, which is wiping out all consciousness of Aboriginality. Some languages may not be spoken anymore, but in terms of Aboriginal people knowing who we are, it didn't work. But yeah, there is that other side to it where you have to appreciate that however rough and basic they were, there was some protection there. No, they are based on real incidents, and that's what I was referring to in the beginning. A lot of the idea of a story in Aboriginal culture is not the same as in Western culture, because when you talk about a story in Western culture, there is that implication that it's probably not true. You know, it could be a good story, but there is that implication that it's mythical or made up. But a story for us is like a very important philosophy. It's like there's none of this, is it true or is it not true? You know, a story is always based in truth, you know, and it may have changed a bit over time in terms of, you know, to be able to be still communicated as over generations. But essentially stories for us are a very important way of communicating. And they have their basis in truth. So this has their basis in truth. But when I say I use fictional devices, I'm not sure if I always do, because the storytelling devices that Aboriginal people use are certain things that Western people would call literary devices anyway, but they're also storytelling devices. So, for example, I changed the names of some characters for respect. It's not linear. So sometimes I'm retelling a story that's a retelling of a story that might have happened 100 years before I was born. So that's what I mean about continuation of culture. But the story's being told for my listening. So fictional devices are things like pseudonyms, a way of it being non-linear because it doesn't matter what thing happened first. what matters is all these things happened. So that's, and also fictional devices in terms, it's been described by critiques as using fictional devices that for me were purely descriptive devices, because the landscape is very important in this book. It's very, and land is very important for, like for example, I'm Wiradjuri. This is set in a place in Australia which was renamed the Riverina, but it's actually the Wiradjuri lands. And so I was very descriptive about the land, and that was also seen as a fictional device. And I don't necessarily disagree with that terminology, but it is also a storytelling device as well. Okay, there's a couple of things. There is storytelling, as you mentioned. There is also just the whole idea of protest poetry, activist poetry, which is also a continuation of oral tradition in a way, but it's responding to particular times, like particularly the activist poetry by people like Lionel Fogarty, for example, which talks about corrupt governments and brings things to attention that you wouldn't be able to write in the media. So there's activist poetry and song that's been very much alive in our culture since colonialism, but it probably wasn't something we had before because it's responding to keeping our culture alive under colonialism. So there's also a number of things that bring people together, like physical activities. Like Aboriginal people, generally speaking, love all sorts of sporting and physical events, which is sort of like a modern corroboree in a way, because we used to be performance people, perform dance, song, quite physical. And under colonial times, Aboriginal people tend to excel at things like, excel at sport a lot. It's not our only area of expertise, but we're writers too. But so a lot of cultural events revolve also around things like football matches and or other football matches in particular. And there's a unique concept in Australia called the Rugby League Knockout, where Aboriginal people come together once a year from all over Australia, and it goes for about 3 days. And it's a series of football competition, elimination games. But the games themselves are important, but it's more than just the games. It's a whole gathering of people who, from various parts of Australia, who might only get to see each other once a year or something like that. Yeah. So there's those things. What else keeps our culture alive is our resilience and our persistence. It's taken a long time, but as people, we've been very persistent about, and I've got a background in education, classroom teaching before I did a PhD. So we have been also very active, and it's taken a long time, and it hasn't always moved the way we wanted it to, or as quick, but we've been very active about getting our knowledge put in school curriculums, because it wasn't there for a while, but from the 1980s onward, there's been a very active push to make sure Aboriginal knowledge is represented. And we also have had, and this is also a really important cultural thing, we also have had settlers now will acknowledge Aboriginal country as a formality wherever they might be. Say Canberra's Ngunnawal country. So if there's a parliamentary meeting or in any kind of public meeting, the speaker is required to say, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people who are the traditional owners. And that's done pretty widely across Australia. And I guess one final thing, a way of keeping our culture alive and well and strong, is our definition of an Indigenous person. In Australia, different countries have different definitions of an Indigenous person, but ours is very inclusive and encompassing of all people who are descended from Aboriginal people. So we recognise, and we don't do reductionist things like, say, you're a quarter Aboriginal or you're an eighth Aboriginal. No. If you know your descent lines and your country and the community knows you, you could be blue-eyed and blonde-haired and you're still Aboriginal. It's not about what you look like anymore, because colonialism did change that a lot, what we look like. And so, but that's a real display of strength and resistance, that we don't accept those colonial blood quotients. We know who we all are. Just to wrap up on the book, yeah, it is a very... it deals with a lot of very serious issues, but in a very... Aboriginal people are really good at humour, and humour has been a very strong tool of resistance. It's how we've kept ourselves going. And sometimes people say the things that Aboriginal people can laugh about, you know, but that is laughter, that humour, that has also been a real catalyst for keeping us together. And we all understand, when people say blackfella humour, everybody knows what Aboriginal people know what they're talking about. So there's a lot of humour in this book. Like, it deals with a lot of serious issues, like the assimilation policy, like the oppression and assault of women. But it does it in a way that also shows the strength of the women and the people and the humour of the people. And a lot of people say, yeah, I can really laugh at this book.